Basically, we just recorded a whole bunch of stuff about your paper. I'm still going to upload that, so that way if you had questions or if you weren't here or whatever, you'll be able to understand what we went over with the paper. But, again, bear with me. I'm going to shift some stuff then, right? So there will not be a quiz due tonight. Okay, that quiz will move to tomorrow night. Alright, because I'm still going to need 2 days to get through Westward expansion and the stuff that we're going to try to cover at this point. And another thing that I've decided to do is I have some, I'm going to be honest with you, they're kind of remedial for you guys. They're definitely remedial for what we've done in here. Meaning that means they're simple, right? That's what you're going to ask. Okay? But one, I also need the minor grades, right? So it's basically going to be like you're going to watch something and it's like fill in the blank real fast and it should be super easy. We'll knock it out in a period. Yeah, I've got one scheduled for Friday right now. Thursday will be a discussion day, but we're also going to review the test that we just took on Thursday. Okay? So here's the thing. What I'm probably going to do is push at least one of them. I think there's a short answer this week called It wasn't about slavery. I absolutely want you to read that. I think it's an interesting take on the Civil War. But what I will probably do is push it. I don't know. Honestly, I might push it until after break. Okay? No, actually, I'll probably make it do next week. Because I think I can test you on that, because that's talking about really the build-up to the Civil War. It's not the Civil War itself, right? But some of the rationale behind the causes. And so I think I can include that on the next test. Okay? So we'll do that next week. So you won't actually have a short response. In fact, this is going to end up being a fairly easy week for you this week. Then all you're going to have is one quiz this week. What's up?
When is that?
Thursday.
Next Thursday?
Yeah. Yeah. So basically, I've got like these because the third 6 weeks is so short. It's like a 2-week unit, test, and then it's final exam week. There's only 5 weeks in this 6 weeks. There's only 4 weeks before finals. And we'll talk about finals more when we get closer to it, because finals procedures and policies are still up in the air here. Okay? They tried to make your finals in the afternoon, and then the district said no, and so now your finals are in the morning again. And don't worry, we'll have a whole conversation about it and what's going to happen. Okay? On the bright side, as far as like exemptions goes, it doesn't matter for you. All have to take my final, right? You cannot exempt on the Lone Star side, okay?
Is it going to be like every other test that we have?
Pretty much, except it's slightly easier and it's curved.
Sounds good to me.
Okay?
Is our essay going in the same Lone Star, or is it going in both?
It goes in both.
Is it just going to be a major grade?
Yes, it's the essay is a major in the high school side, and it's 20% of your grade on the college side. Okay, what's up?
If you pass the class, you get a 0 on the essay.
Theoretically, yes. Theoretically, you could get an 80, but that's not happening because that would require you to get 100 on all the exams. That definitely ain't happening, right? So at that point, let's just say for the sake of argument, you averaged a 67 on all the tests, right? That would detract 30%, that would detract another 10 points from your grade. So now you're down 10 on the tests, down 20 on the essay. That drops you down 30 points. Assuming you got 100 on everything else, that would give you a 70 exactly in the class, except if you're getting 67s on the test, let's assume you got a 67 on the final as well. The final's 10% of your grade. There goes another 3 points. You're down into the D category, assuming again that you've gotten 100% of your points on your short responses and your quizzes, which isn't going to happen. Okay, so theoretically, could you? Yes, but theoretically, the sun's not going to rise tomorrow. I wouldn't gamble on that. You do know that, right? Like eventually, the sun will burn out. It's a star.
I'll just blow up.
It's whatever, yeah. It'll happen eventually. Not in any of our lifetimes. I hope not.
Do that Elon Musk.
All right. So we're just going to start over. We're going to completely start over. We're going to go to the election of 1844. I told you we had the Whig Party. The Whig Party is a footnote in history. I don't care about it. It doesn't matter. They don't really win much. They're for lack of a better term, they're a protest party that was created in order to protest Andrew Jackson. Okay? All right, that's it. They don't win a whole lot. Jackson's presidency coincides with increases in democracy. We remember that, right? Pretty sure that was on the test you just took.
Yeah, you don't have a problem.
More people are able to vote. Like all white dudes can now vote, regardless of property ownership and things like that. Okay, that's more democratic in terms of like the Democratic Party and Jacksonian democracy. So the Whigs are going to struggle to win in that regard, right? Polk wins the presidency, and Polk, I told you, actually, Polk's one of those guys that you could probably put on the list of good presidents if you don't care about war, right? Like if you don't care about killing people to get what you want, which from a governmental standpoint, I don't know that you should. I don't know. That's on you, right? But Polk's idea here is basically we're going to try to expand the United States. After the Spanish-American War, we're basically going to get to what is the contiguous United States today, right? So all of this after the Spanish-American War is basically America, okay? And that's largely in part to Polk. Now, a lot of our presidents, and Polk's one of them around this time, they're going to be very non-committal as it pertains to slavery, right? Again, for the most part, most people in America at this point are trying to punt on the issue of slavery, meaning they want to kick the can down the road and let somebody else deal with it in the future because it's too difficult to actually address,
Like Thomas Jefferson.
which is a fact.
He wanted to kick the can down the road too.
Well, I mean, the Founding Fathers do it, right? But the Founding Fathers at least understood that eventually they had to act. That's why the Founding Fathers are still sort of in control when the slave trade, or not the slave trade, the importation of slaves in the United States. We'll talk about this in the lecture next week. We'll talk about sort of ideologies as it pertains to slavery. Believe it or not, most of our Founding Fathers, despite the fact that many of them owned slaves, thought slavery was bad and wrong. They actually did. They just didn't know how to get rid of it. They weren't smart enough to end it, and they hoped, naively, they hoped that it would sort of end on their own. It's really the second generation of Americans, right? Like your John C. Calhoun people who get ridiculous about slavery, and they're like, slavery is good. It's good for the black person. No, it's not. Right? No, they do. They call it like a positive. Like it's a like a positive. Whatever they basically say, like, I mean, this is really next week's lecture, right? But they're basically saying like, oh, slavery is better than like going to work in a textile mill because the slave master like treats you like family. I'm just saying, if your parents treat you like that, run away when you were 18. You understand? Don't go back. Your parents are abusive if they're beating you like that. You understand what I'm saying? Like you can't tell me that's familial relations, right? But they're also making the comment, they're like, the slave doesn't have to worry about working for wages and where they're going to eat and where they're going to sleep because all of it is provided by the master. Have you ever seen pictures of slave quarters? What do they look like, Maddie?
Like little sheds.
Shed, that's an excellent word. Shed is an excellent word. Dirt floor, like rickety shacks, right? I mean, slightly better than lean-tos. You know what a lean-to is?
No.
Something that does not have four walls. That's why it's called lean, right? Okay? Like, no, not good. Not good at all. Okay, again, Polk is a relatively well-versed politician, right? Which is probably one of the things that makes him a game. Okay, and you'll learn that as we get through this course, right, throughout the course of the entire school year here. Some presidents understand politics better than other presidents, right? Some presidents are utterly lost when it comes to actual politics and compromise and things of that nature, right? Polk was Speaker of the House. He had been in Congress. It's a little bit of a double-edged sword. I want you to understand that, right? There are positives to presidents that have a significant amount of experience, right? Like if you look at my little, have you ever looked at this little timeline over here, right? Like you see all those different colors on the timeline? Those are all people that have like varying military experience or governmental experience or whatever, right? Like they did all of these different things. So if you look at like William Henry Harrison, for instance, right? Active duty military, territorial governor, military, House of Representatives, state legislature, U.S. Senate, and then President of the United States. Like the dude did a lot, right? Right? And then every now and then we have like Woodrow Wilson, who was a governor for a very short period of time and then President of the United States. And he sucked. Right? And you have like Donald Trump, who had literally zero governmental experience ever anywhere, under any circumstance. Right? I'm gonna be honest with you, like some of these people that were in government for like literally forever, not a good thing either. Right? That increases the possibility of corruption. Okay? But Polk's fairly good at what he does, right? Alright, so the U.S. is already trying to annex Texas, right? Very brief sort of Texas history. We know that Texas gained its independence in 1836. Is that right? I didn't take Texas history because I'm not from here, but I think it's 1836. And they're a republic for a short period of time, right? If you need a little background on the history, basically Mexico. This is so ironic. I love telling the story. It's so comical. Mexico. Okay, so Mexico had an open border policy, right? You know what that means? Right? Like anybody can come in, and so a whole bunch of white Americans went to Texas and settled Texas, and then proceeded to take over Texas and kick the Mexicans out.
When it says the U.S. annexed Texas, does that mean like Texas left or Texas got like kicked out?
Annex means to add to it.
Oh.
So the U.S. annexes Texas, that means Texas is added to the Union.
Okay, so Texas is now part of the United States.
Correct.
Okay. So what's part of the United States?
No, Texas was its own country for like 8 years.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yeah. Okay, wait, aren't y'all? Did y'all not go through like 8th grade Texas history, 7th grade Texas history here?
I don't think so.
No, that was a long time ago. Texas is one of 2 states that were at one point in time independent countries. Hawaii is the other one, yeah. And we'll get to that in the early next semester because Hawaii is going to be annexed in 1898 around the same time or as a part of the Spanish-American War, right? So this is the Mexican-American War, and then in the late 19th century we're going to have the Spanish-American War, and we'll get to that, right? Again, Polk wants war.
So he wanted this one. Like,
Polk wants the Mexican-American War. Because Polk, okay, so here's the thing. Again, the U.S. has annexed Texas, but Mexico didn't like that because Mexico didn't really like the fact that Texas seceded in the first place. Mexico didn't really want to recognize Texas independence and sovereignty. Okay, so once the United States annexes Texas, right, now Mexico has 2 options, right? Because now you can't even pretend like, oh, you're still a part of us. Nope. Yes. So at one point, okay, if we go back and we look at old maps, right, we know that Spain conquered Mexico. Yes, it was a Spanish territory, and basically New Spain, right, cut all the way through Texas, New Mexico, southern Utah, Nevada, and then basically that line right there that separates Oregon from the lower states. All of this down here was all Mexico. All of it. All of it was Mexico. Okay? Now, part of the problem is Mexico is grossly overextended here, and Mexico has some issues because the Spanish had the issues first. Understand this, right? The Spanish had the issues first because they were sending their like Jesuit priests, right, like Spanish missionaries, right, actual like Catholic missionaries, in through Mexico and then coming up north, and they were very isolated because of like rough terrain, right? There's a whole lot of like desert and mountains over here, not easy to travel through, right? That isolated those people and it created some significant issues. To where the reality is this region of Mexico, when Mexico gains its independence, is actually very different than like Mexico City, right? In fact, I've known a couple of people from Mexico who have tried to explain to me that like northern Mexico and Mexico City are sort of the equivalent of the American South and New York City, right? Like, yeah, they're the same country, but they don't really have the same ideologies or culture. Okay.
Okay, so I just want to understand. Texas was part of Mexico.
Yes.
And then they left Mexico, but Mexico didn't want to.
Mexico didn't really want them to leave.
Okay, so then they were like, you're still part of us. But then.
Well, it's okay. It's one of those weird concepts because they like there's a Texas War for Independence. Okay, Texas declares its independence. But Mexico doesn't really recognize it.
Okay.
Okay?
And then they're like mad when they join the United States.
Yes, because at that point you don't have any other choice. Because here's the thing, Mexico, like Texas goes off and does its own thing. By the way, just so you understand too, Texaco is predominantly seceding from Mexico because Texans wanted slaves. Right? The whites that were settling into Texas were slave owners. They were actually told they were not allowed to bring their slaves with them. They brought their slaves anyways because, hey, who wouldn't, right? Especially when you're talking about incredibly, like, fertile, rich cotton fields, right, down here in basically where we live, right? Okay? All right, so all kinds of cotton fields down here, they need the slaves for it, okay? When the United States goes to annex Texas, at this point, Mexico can no longer pretend like Texas is still a part of Mexico. You understand? Okay? So, obviously, we haven't gotten there yet, but we know, like, the South secedes from the Union, yes? The South secedes from the North. Does the North recognize that? No. They're like, you can't leave. No. I don't accept you breaking up with me. We're still in a relationship. Right? Now, here's the thing. Like, I mean, if you use that sort of analogy, like, understand, if you break up with somebody and they're like, no, nope. Right? Like, no, you're not allowed to break up with me. Okay?
Do that in real life.
What? There's free speech. You can say whatever you want. But if you all just go on about your lives, right? One of you is not in a relationship, the other one still thinks they are, right? So, because somebody delusional, somebody not in touch with reality. But then like, you broke up with him and they were like, no, you can't break up with me. And he was like, all right, whatever, I'm going to live my life anyways. And then you start dating somebody else.
Then they're forced.
Now, at that point, they're like, oh,
Well, that's embarrassing.
okay, yeah, I guess we really did break up. Like, I thought you just needed some space. Like, I thought you just wanted your space for a minute and then you just won't come back. But I guess, like, you're... Yes? Do we understand this analogy now? Okay? So Mexico's not really happy about it. Again, I think I told y'all yesterday before we got sidetracked. Polk is basically the kind of guy who wants a little war. Just a little war. Right? Like, just a little war. Right? So that he can go in and, like, garner support for it. Right? And that's going to garner support for expansion. By the way, they're also going to do this through, like, one of the earliest examples of just American military and governmental deceit. Right? Because the Mexican-American War begins where? Well, we don't really know because the United States says it begins like here in Texas and Mexico says it begins here in Mexico, right? Like, they're on opposite sides of the Rio Grande River. That's a fairly substantial landmark that you should know where you are in relation to. And I'll be honest with you, it's probably Texans and Americans crossing the Rio and attacking Mexico, and then claiming that Mexico entered into Texas and attacked us, because then that provides us justification for war, yes? Okay? I don't know if that's true. I mean, look, Mexico was unhappy. It would not have been outside of the realm of possibility that Mexico could have actually attacked the United States. Okay? Well, let's call it the United States at this point because Tyler has already annexed it, right? Even though Mexico doesn't really. Yeah, John Tyler was the president right before Polk. So Texas has already been annexed, but Polk wants the war, one, to force Mexico to recognize the annexation and the fact that Texas is part of the United States, but also, he wants all this. He wants more than just Texas. He wants all of this out here too. He wants New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, California, Southern Utah, all that stuff. Okay? Because that's going to be a part of his legacy. Right? Initially, there's some people that are opposed to the Mexican-American War. If you're an abolitionist, you don't like it because Texas is going to come in. Well, Texas is like a slave state, right? And then there's a fear that we're going to further extend slavery, right? Because we had the Missouri Compromise, and the Missouri Compromise basically said all of the land south of the Missouri-Arkansas border right here was all slave territory. So if we're annexing stuff out of here, if we're taking stuff out of here, that's going to become slave, right? And I forget the year, up to 1840 something, we're still balanced in the Senate. Right? Meaning we have an equal number of slave states as we have free states. Okay? And so that's a significant concern, specifically in the Senate, because if one side is to become, if it's going to become unbalanced, right, then basic democracy, you also know how basic democracy works? Majority rule. Right? Like, one of the things people actually use as an example of why democracy is bad is because democracy is like two wolves and a sheep deciding what's for lunch. You understand? If you're the sheep, you're going to lose and get eaten. Yes? And that is true of democracy. Right? Because it's just simple majority rule. Now you'll learn next year how we have provisions to prevent that. Right? But that's why the Senate is so concerned. If one entity, free or slave, dominates the Senate, then they can force their will on everybody else. Okay? Alright? The war is a relatively quick war and a successful war, and then we're going to annex California. Okay? California is going to be significant because California has a lot of ports, and it's going to open us up to the opportunity of expansion into economic opportunity with Asia. Okay? Right? So that's really a gateway to the Eastern world. It allows us to go from sea to sea, right, in which we can really operate globally at this point. Right? As the East Coast, we can get to Europe. West Coast, we can get to Asia. Those are the two places that you really ultimately want to be. Right? So by 47, Mexico completely surrenders. And California, I mean, look, California claims that it's a country for like a minute. It's not. No, not really. Well, what is significant in California is actually right before the Mexican-American War ends, they find gold in California. Okay? Now, obviously, this is significant because if you found gold in that territory, everybody's going to want that territory. Mexico probably would have fought harder for it. The two guys, Sutter and I forget the other dude's name, do everything in their power to keep it under wraps, right, so that nobody knows. Okay? By 48, the news is out there, right? Everybody knows by that point that you're going to have a massive rush of people into the California territory. Okay? In fact, like 300,000 people arrived almost instantaneously. You had a place like San Francisco. It was a very, very tiny little town, right? And then all of a sudden gold is found. And interestingly enough, San Francisco becomes a ghost town because everybody leaves San Francisco and goes up into the hills right here, right? Because that's where they found gold. Okay? And then other people move into San Francisco and sort of rebuild it and turn it into a real city because that's a port. That's where people from Asia are coming in. Just so you understand, like, again, if you are in, let's say you're in Virginia and you want to go try your luck to get rich in California, right? What are your options? How do you get there? You can go over land, that's going to take months, right? And you might die of cholera or any one of a number of other diseases, right? You could literally leave Virginia, sail all the way around South America, all the way back up and come to California that way. That's a pain in the butt, right? That's a very long journey, right? You can sail from Virginia down to Panama, right? Right, where Panama is like it's at its most narrow. At that point, it's only going to take you about 2 weeks, maybe, to get from coast to coast, right? So you could do that and then wait for a new ship, right, in Panama and then come up. There was a land route across Veracruz, Mexico? Is Veracruz on the East Coast? Anybody know? I don't know. I don't get to go to like Mexican vacation spots. What?
Get in California, you get annexed to a free state.
Yeah, California will come in as a free state.
Why is that?
Because
It's not below the, or it's not above the line, right?
so this is where the gold is found, right? Up here. Okay? So the gold is actually found sort of Sacramento, Sierra Nevada foothills, right? So if you look at a map of California, Sacramento is the capital of California. Sacramento is about right here. Okay? This is the line. So if we draw that line across, it is only very, very, very southern California that would be south of that line and theoretically could have slaves. North of that line would be free. Okay? We're going to get there because we're going to have the Compromise of 1850, which is what ultimately lands California into the Union as a free state. Again, I don't care this much. We're attacking Mexico. I don't know why I didn't put this in before California, but I don't care that much. All right, I'm not going to test you on this war. It doesn't really matter that much to me in the slightest. I do want to get to this. This is the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which is what ends it. Mexico is forced to cede Texas, California, Arizona, New Mexico, a little bit of some other territories. You can see the map there in the background, right? So basically, according to the map in the background, like that was already American Texas. This is the rest of Texas. Yes, it goes all the way up into Wyoming, right? And then this is the rest of the territory that is ceded. This is still Mexico at this point, okay? Under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, that is still Mexico. Southern Arizona is actually going to be purchased from from Mexico a couple of years later, right? This is going to create, again, more economic opportunity and a flood of people coming into the new area, okay? In 1851, you have the Land Act, right, which is allowing Americans to essentially cheat Mexicans out of their property because to the victor go the spoils, right? If you don't have sort of clear titles, actual documentation providing ownership of the land, most Mexican Americans, I guess they're Mexican Americans now, Mexicans who are now all of a sudden finding themselves out to be American because they've now been traded in terms of countries. The court system creates provisions that allow them to lose their land. Right? And then we have the Gadsden Purchase down here, which is southern Arizona, and it's really purchased for two reasons, right? One, it becomes an opportunity for the United States to sort of displace some people, but more importantly, this is an issue between the North and the South, right? So by the time we get to the middle of the 19th century, right, 1850, we are in the process of creating a transcontinental railroad. Okay? So that railroad that we're currently building, right there is Chicago, Illinois. Okay? And that is essentially, I know Missouri, like everybody talks about St. Louis, Missouri being the gateway to the West. The reality is it probably ought to be Chicago, right? So right there is Chicago, and there's a railroad that we're creating from Chicago to San Francisco. Okay? That is a northern route. I think I told you once before that like the North and the South hate each other so much their railroads are not even the same size. Yes? And so the Gadsden Purchase is going to be an opportunity to create a railroad route from New Orleans, right, which is essentially the southern gateway to the West, across into Los Angeles down here. This land for the Gadsden Purchase is significantly easier easier to build on than like the rest of the Rockies if they had to go through northern New Mexico and northern Arizona, right, and whatnot. Okay. We'll talk about the actual laying of the Transcontinental Railroad at a later point, right? This brings us to the Wilmot Proviso. Okay, this is just, we're now back into Congress trying to figure out what to do with land, right? So we're going to allow Texas to be brought in as a slave state. All the other territories would be free states. Okay, a lot of people didn't agree with that. There's a lot of debate that goes on in Congress over what should be happening with all this newfound territory. Okay, ultimately this doesn't pass. Okay, but we are now entering into a point, right? Like we're now in the 1840s, 1850s. We can no longer kick the can down the road any further because it's coming to a head. It's too much now. And as the United States continues to expand, you have to decide what to do with these places. You have to. Okay? And the reality is, I hope you understand that if you look at the United States and you were to draw a line, right, that is a straight line from Missouri and Arkansas, yes? Okay? If we were to draw that line straight across the United States, you understand that we would have way more free states than slave states if we still operated as it is. The South is not going to be okay with that, right? Because the South is already beginning to fear that there are people who are hell-bent on ending slavery and ending Southern ways of life. Okay? In fact, I don't think I told you this when we talked about Andrew Jackson. At one point in time, Andrew Jackson stopped U.S. mail. Okay? Solely to stop abolitionists from sending letters and pamphlets and magazines and newspapers into the South advocating for, like, abolition, the end of slavery. Which is a wildly complex issue because, just so you understand, it was illegal to teach slaves how to read. You understand that? Which it should. Why? Because knowledge is power. If I want to control you, I want to keep you stupid. And the easiest way to keep you stupid is to keep you from being able to read. The reality is, once you know how to read, you have access to all knowledge. You understand that? I'm just personally appalled at the stupidity of America in this day and age. When literally all knowledge, all of you have all knowledge in the palm of your hand right now. Once you know how to read, the only other thing that you need to do at that point is figure out how to discern. You know what that word means? Figure out what's right and wrong. If I told you the Holocaust didn't happen, would you believe me? Why not? I'm a history teacher. Why wouldn't you believe me? Nobody ever knows if anybody's lying. That's what discernment is figuring it out. Now, which question? Where? Engulf the nation. Overcame. Put it over top of. It's what everybody's dealing with now, right? So the debate over slavery engulfs the nation. Now everybody in the nation is dealing with slavery. Like I said, no more kicking the can down the road. We're going to have to figure something out, right? Because the other thing is, once some of those abolition papers have started going into the South, right, and advocating for the actual abolition, okay, that's creating issues in the South. It's creating slave rebellions, right? I mean, by this point, we haven't talked about it, but hopefully you already learned it at some point in time in your life about the whole, like, Underground Railroad concept, yes? Like, you have people smuggling slaves out of the South, right? And in some instances, all the way up into Canada. Okay? Because I'll be honest with you, if I was a slave and I tried to escape from freedom, or tried to escape to freedom, right, I would not stop in Pennsylvania or New York. Okay? I would go all the way to Canada. I would leave the United States altogether. Okay? Because the United States government allows for slavery, and the United States government still controls New York. All right? All right. So this leads us to the election of 1848. At this point, we are going to still be concerned with slavery and what we're going to do about slaves. Taylor is actually going to win this election. So I told you a minute ago, it's with a K, right? So, see? I told you a minute ago that the Whigs are sort of a footnote in history, and they are. I don't care that much. But Taylor is a Whig, okay? And Taylor is going to be able to win in part because of the Mexican-American War, right? And what Taylor does in terms of supporting the Mexican-American War, right? We also have the creation of the Free Soil Party, which is ultimately splitting the vote a little bit. I mean, they actually attract members of both parties. You'll learn this in more detail next year when you get into government. Third parties do exist from time to time. They pop up. They're losers, but they can shift things. Okay? They won't win themselves, but they absolutely can impact the outcome of an election, right? So they're going to play a role in splitting votes, right? Which is, again, a possible issue. You might actually see this happen a year from now, right? But y'all know today's election day, yes?
For what?
For what?
There's some bonds and some constitutional amendments to the state of Texas Constitution. Not big stuff that really matters, but a lot of Americans will not. In fact, I would be shocked if 6,000 people vote tonight for the school board bond, for the LCISD bond. Most people don't show up and vote in an odd number of years, but we have elections, multiple elections every single year. Most Americans don't know that, right? But we already have legitimate third-party candidates that are running for president of the United States next year, and they might very well siphon off votes from the Republican and the Democrat and ultimately be responsible for who is victorious. They won't win, right? But they could shift the vote and cause either Trump or Biden to win based upon where they're drawing support from, right? So this Free Soil Party is basically a singular abolitionist party, right? And they're not, again, they don't really last long. They're going to ultimately end up becoming the Republicans for the most part, right? But this is going to bring us to the Compromise of 1850. Because again, I've told you, slavery is now a massive issue. Okay? And at this point, we want to introduce California and New Mexico in as free states. Okay? The Compromise of 1850, California is going to come in. California easily met the population requirement, and they met the population requirement very quickly because of the California Gold Rush. Right? There are population requirements that are necessary in order for states to enter into the United States today. Right? If you don't know this, the United States has a couple of territories around the world. Puerto Rico is one of them. Right? Puerto Rico is roughly 3 million people. That is more than enough to become a state. If Puerto Rico petitions to become a state, they probably would. Right? On the other hand, there's also like American Samoa, which has 100,000 people living there. It's in the South Pacific. Okay? American Samoa could not become a state today. It does not meet the population requirement. Right? Now, theoretically, it could like join with Guam, and then I guess maybe together they could become a state or whatever. All right. Okay. Let's see. We're gonna have popular sovereignty. That's another big thing that comes out of all of this. These debates, because we can't really decide it in Congress. We're gonna allow people into the territories to decide it for themselves. Now, that's going to get really, really dicey with Kansas specifically, right? Because right here is Kansas. It's right next to Missouri. Missouri and Kansas hate each other. Okay? And Missouri is going to try to, Kansas is going to try to come in as a free state because you got a lot of Northerners coming in there. Then you have a lot of Southerners from Missouri that come in. They're going to try and like make it a slave state. Okay? But that's the idea of popular sovereignty, right? Again, at this point, Congress is now fully engaged in the concept of slavery and what to do, how to create these compromises, who is going to take the lead, what can we do in order to sort of placate both sides to make things as smooth as possible, right? I mean, John C. Calhoun, again, that was Jackson's vice president. He is a South Carolinian. He basically comes out and says, if you challenge slavery, we will secede. Right? You cannot end slavery. Attempts to end slavery will result in secession. Okay? Then you have other people that they don't want fugitive slaves to have to be returned into slavery in the South. That's Daniel Webster, but he also doesn't want secession to be an option, right? Then you have people like Seward, who will eventually go on to become Secretary of State under Abraham Lincoln. And Seward is just an anti-slavery guy all the way around. He wants slavery nowhere, no return of fugitive slaves, slavery is evil, gotta die, yada, 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 right? Taylor dies, his vice president steps in, he's going to support Clay and a lot of Clay's proposals about the Compromise of 1850 and how we're going to get things done, right? At this point, we have a guy named Stephen Douglas, who is sitting in the Senate. Douglas is going to break Clay's proposals into a whole bunch of different things and try to pass them individually rather than passing them as a singular entity, right? Because this is the way government, and I'm going to be honest with you, this is the way government should work. Should work. Doesn't, but this is the way government should work, right? If government is trying to pass 40 different things in one piece of legislation, and one of those 40 is terrible, you should vote against it. You should. Even if you need the other 39, you should vote against it, not to do the one terrible thing. Okay? So Douglas is going to say, look, we're going to back up, and we're going to try to do these one by one by one by one. Okay? And that's going to make this a little bit more palatable, a little bit more easy to swallow. Right? So California is going to come in as a free state. Right? Texas is going to maintain its boundaries. Okay? Texas is going to get paid to pay back like war debts and their debt that was accumulated over those few years that they were an independent nation. Right? That means you have northern states subsidizing a slave state. They're obviously not happy about that. The Fugitive Slave Act is going to pass. Now, there were other Fugitive Slave Acts prior to this, but this one is pretty atrocious. Right now, at this point, basically, northern states cannot prevent southern bounty men from entering into their state, rounding up black people and taking them back to the South. Right? There was a movie made a handful of years ago called 12 Years a Slave. You don't know the movie? Have you heard of it? Okay? Because here's the thing. If you were a free black, and you understand there are free blacks in America, yes? Right? So if you are a black man in, let's just say, Pennsylvania, right? You live in Philadelphia, and you have a trade. You are a printer or a ship maker, right? Or a carpenter, or whatever you are, okay? And all of a sudden, southern bounty men come looking for escaped slaves. Are you in danger? Yes. Oh, they just kidnapped black people. They didn't care. Because they were getting paid for returning people. It didn't matter who. Y'all understand, like, black people didn't have, like, slaves, specifically slaves. There was no paperwork for slaves. There's no record for slaves. Do you know why so many black people have, like, the last name Washington today? Because they weren't really given names. They weren't given surnames. Right? So all of a sudden, when they're just all like freed in 1865 at the end of the Civil War, like all of a sudden your name was Joe. That was it, just Joe, nothing else. Right? Well, that doesn't work. So what are we going to do? Well, we've got to just assign you last names. So we're going to assign you like Washington, right? Because he was the founder of the United States, or things like. I mean, go. It's plagiarized. It's wildly plagiarized. But there's a mini-series or a book called Roots that I forget what it's plagiarized from, otherwise I would tell you to go get the original, right? But like there's a whole explanation or concept of what happens in there as slaves come into the United States. I mean, they're stripped of their culture, they're prevented their culture, they're prevented any sort of aboriginal or historical names that they had with their old tribe, their old people. They were not allowed to speak traditional languages. They were basically void of any sort of personalized history, right? Okay. So again, the Fugitive Slave Act becomes a significantly important because there's a whole bunch of Northerners that hate it, but they are now sort of handcuffed by law, and they can't even use the court system Like, this is how bad it gets. If that bountyman comes up from the south and basically just grabs a free black person, right? He can't even petition to his local court for his freedom, right? He has to be returned, quote unquote, returned, right? Because you can actually get thrown in jail if you are interfering with the slave catchers based upon the Fugitive Slave Act, right? Okay, so it's becomes wildly complex. There's a whole bunch of people that are unhappy with it, but the national government is going to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act because it's trying to maintain the Union at this point, right? And that's sort of the key concept. Okay. By the election of '52, we've got Winfield Scott, who was a general during the Mexican-American War, against Franklin Pierce. God, Pierce is terrible. But Pierce is going to win, right? Pretty easily because, one, Pierce has a good hype man, right? I mean, Pierce was a relatively attractive person. Apparently that matters, right? I mean, I don't know. I guess it does. But so Pierce is, I guess he looks the part, and I guess that matters to people. I mean, he's ridiculously unqualified. He's absolutely terrible. He can't lead. During his presidency, we get the Kansas-Nebraska crisis, which I talked about just a minute ago. Right? You basically have the Kansas territory that is beginning to become populated. They're going to apply for statehood. That's going to lead to a vote over whether the Kansas territory is going to be a free territory or a slave territory. Yes, right. And then there becomes some significant issues with like ballot integrity because as they go to vote on it, that's what popular sovereignty is, right? Popular sovereignty says you get to vote over whether or not you want to be a free state or a slave state. And what prevents people from voting twice or 10 times, right? I mean, especially not in 1850. You know, there's no like election security whatsoever, right? I mean, eventually, y'all know who LBJ is? No? LBJ was JFK's vice president, so LBJ actually becomes the 36th president of the United States. He was a former Texas senator, right? Now, before the election of 2020, you could actually go to like the Senate.gov website, and you could read the whole story about how LBJ cheated in order to become a senator, right? Like just stuffed a ballot box, literally called a guy up and was like, how many votes do I need to win? The guy was like, you need 200. And the next morning, like all of a sudden, 300 votes for Johnson were there. And Johnson won, right? And then 2020 happened and that story went away. They pulled it off the website, which I find terribly alarming, right? Because obviously a lot of people said 2020 was all like faked. You cannot pretend like there wasn't election integrity issues 50 years ago, 150 years ago, if you're pretending like they didn't have, you know what I'm saying? Like that's a little suspect, all right?
Chargers, make sure AirPods
We will stop there.
cell phones are put away in the hallway, and teachers be reminded